For quite a while now, I have been looking forward to create this video where we're going to create a new Blazor server app in Radzen Blazor Studio that is going to display some real-time data from a database. We are going to use a MS SQL database, and then we're actually going to use the SQL table dependency and signal R to listen after changes in the database and to display it in a Radzen DataGrid. We will start from scratch with everything, so we will create a new project. We will also set a database up in the MS SQL by using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. There are many of the same concepts from an earlier video that I created where I display real-time data just by using Blazor. One of the big changes from that video and to this video is that we of course are going to use Radzen Blazor Studio, but also that in the earlier video I used .NET 6. And in this video we're going to do it in .NET 7. And there is actually some small differences that we have to look at and some errors that we have to take care of. But the first thing we will do is to make a new application inside Radzen Blazor Studio. We do have to just go and open it in Visual Studio after we created it to include some NuGet packages. We could do it via the command line, but I will actually just do it in Visual Studio so that we can do it easily with the UI that Visual Studio provide. So inside Radzen Blazor Studio, let's say new application, and we want to choose the Blazor server application, so we just hit next. We want to give the project a name. I will just call it real-time data, and we're going to use .NET 7, so that's okay. The theme is material, that's also okay. You can always go and play around with it, but then we want to choose a directory, and I'll just go to my desktop and then create a new folder, and let's call it real-time. And when we're inside the new folder, we will just say select folder and say finish. And the reason I just created the project inside Radzen Blazor Studio instead of Visual Studio is that it will go and automatically install the NuGet packages that we need to use when we use Radzen Blazor Studio and when we use their components. So let's go and open this application inside Visual Studio so that we can include the NuGet packages. So I'll just right click the Visual Studio icon and open Visual Studio, and then I want to open a project or solution, and inside here we have our real-time folder, so I'll just say open and then open the solution. So now when that's open, we can go to our Solution Explorer, right click on the project and say manage NuGet packages. So let's go to browse, and there is two NuGet packages I want to install. The first one is SQL table dependency. It is an old library, but it works. So that's the one we're going to use. SQL table dependency is this yellow icon, and let's go and say install and say that I accept. So now when that is installed, we want to also install signal R, and we actually want to say signal R.client. So here we get the Microsoft ASP.NET Core signal R .client, and because we're using .NET 7, we're going to use the latest stable 7 version, so just install, and again we want to accept, and now that should be installed. So for now I don't think we need to use Visual Studio anymore. We can just go and close it, and if it asks you to change the items, then just say save. And then I actually think we might need to close Radzen Blazor Studio again and then open it again, so that we just reopen the project to make sure that the new changes are being updated in our project. So let's open our application again, the real-time data solution, and actually I think we should just try and go and run this to see if it still works. It should work, and as you can see it still works. So let's close this and say stop. So now that we have set up the NuGet packages and a simple Radzen Blazor Studio application, which is just a Blazor server app, let's go to Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio so that we can create the database and also an employee table that we're going to manipulate data in. So we're going to say connect, and let's expand our databases. So as you can see, I have been playing around with it a little bit. So let's right click the databases and say new database. And the first thing we will do is to give it a name. So let's call this for company DB. And we don't want to click OK yet because we want to go to the options tab. And if we scroll a bit down, we can see this broker enabled, and we want to set this to true. And what that is doing is that it enables our SQL table dependency class to listen to changes in the database. So let's say OK, and then let's expand the company DB and expand the tables, we can see we have no tables yet. So let's right click the tables, say new, and we want to add a new table. The first thing I will do is just to change the name to employee. Then we want to add an ID column, which should not be an integer, but an int. And we don't want to allow nulls. And if we just expand this, we can go and say that the identity specification should be set to yes, like this, so that we specify that this ID is the identity in this table. We then also want to add a name, and we will just use the n varchar and set it to max. And we will do the same with a title. So again, we will say n varchar and set it to max again. And again, we don't want to allow nulls. So let's just go and save this. I'll just right click on the tab here and say save employee. So now the tables should be created. If we just click on the tables and update it, we can now see we have our employee table. So let's go and edit the top 200 rows, and let's just add some names. So let's say John, and he is the manager, and let's say James, and he is a student, and hit enter. So now we have a database with a table inside, and there is some data inside our employee table. So let's just minimize the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. And what we want to do next is to connect to the database. So we want to go to the data tab, and we want to use the MS SQL. So we say next. And inside here, we want to choose the Windows authentication type because we're just local on our computer where we use Windows authentication type. We then want to specify the server name. So the easiest way is just to close the SQL Management Studio and just open it again. And when you see here, we have the server name right here. So we can just copy this, just say connect again, so you can minimize this, and just paste the server name in. So when we have done that, we can see in the database that we have some different databases now. We have the company database that we just created, so let's choose that, and then we want to hit next. So inside here, we want to make sure that inside our tables that we have the employees enabled. This is just to make sure that it creates the entity to the table we have called employees. Could also say that it is the model that it's going to create when we tap this. So inside here, we will just say next. And I actually want to create a CRUD page for this employee so that we can manipulate it directly on the website. So on this CRUD scaffolding, we want to tap the generate pages for CRUD operations. And in this case, I want to go with this one, the CRUD option. And let's say next. And then again, I want to make sure that it makes a CRUD page for this employee table. So as you can see now, we said that the entities should contain the employee. We did that on the 2 pages ago, and that's why it's going to create it inside our models. And it even specified even more to say that it comes from the company DB database, and that's here we want to choose the employee. So I think the configurations here are okay. So let's just hit finish. So to be honest, it is a little bit complicated, the coding that we are going to create. But if I mess something up here, I will show you. I will show you the errors I get and how I solve them. So if you just do exactly the same, you should be fine. But the first thing we will set up is the SQL table dependency. And what that will do is to listen to the MS SQL database so that every time there is a change inside our table, if I just open it here, company DB, or tables, and employee, and if we say edit top 200 rows, then every time we're going to make a change to the table, so let's say John 1 instead, and when I hit enter, then the change has been made, and the SQL table dependency will listen to that so that we have a method that is going to be triggered every time there is a change in the database. It will also be if I delete a row or if I was going to add a new row. But let's go back again, and just so that we can see the structure of the Radzen Blazor Studio, how they set a Blazor server app up, we have our data folder where we have our context file. So just like when we set up Entity Framework, we usually create a context file to set the connection to our database, and also, as you can see down here, we have a table that we are referring to as employees. But as you can see, there's no connection string in here because they put it inside the program.cs. So it's right here. They're going to add the context and then get the string from a configuration file. But that is just a short introduction to the context. So if we go to our services folder, we do have a service for this database that we just created. So if we click on that, we can see that this company DB service, it will contain, if we just scroll down a bit, you can see it will contain get employees. So this is the service we're going to call when we want to have all the employees on a page. And this is actually the file that we're going to change. In fact, I don't know if it is a good idea to do, because I don't know if we go to the data and we add a new database that it might just delete this whole service and then make it again with the new tables inside. So let's say that we added a table called orders. Then I actually don't know if it just put it in here at the bottom to say get all orders. But in this video, I will just include the SQL table dependency in here to be a little more safe. You could maybe just go and create another service where you include it in so that you don't mess around with this one. But for now, I'll just stick to this one and hope for the best. But the first thing I'll do is to add a variable that can contain our SQL table dependency, where we tell it that we want to use the employees model. And as you can see right now, it cannot find the namespace or the type of SQL table dependency, and that's because we haven't included up here. So what I will do is to include the table dependency.sql client and also these two. And as you might notice, I also included this if is not Radzen and the end if down here. And what that's basically is doing is that inside our UI view, if you just go to pages and we open the index, then you can see we have this UI that we can see live. And if I don't say this on the table dependency package that we're using, then this will not work. And that's just because this is a very old library that the UI here is not going to handle in any way. So it's nice that the Radzen team has included this, so we have the opportunity to exclude this from the UI view so that we're actually able to use the Radzen Blazor Studio without getting an error inside our UI view in here. The next thing I want to include is the models folder from our company database. So if we look over in our folders, we have this models, and inside that we have our company DB, which is containing our employee. And that's what we want to include here so that we can use our employee model. So I actually do still get this underscore error, but let's try and run it to see if it works. And it will rebuild the project. And as we can see, it will work. So we also have the employees tab right now, and it also works. But let's just go and test it. And I can see we cannot test it actually because there is an error. So let's just close this and say stop. And as you can see inside our employees.razor page, we get this oh no inside the design view here. And that should be simply because inside our service, I just forgot to say that this one should also exclude from the design view. So we will use this one again and also say end if just under. And now you can see the red line also have been removed. And if we save it and run it again, and let's try to go to the employees page. And as you can see, we're still not able to edit or add some new rows, even though that we said that this should be a CRUD page so that it should contain all the CRUD functionality. But I think this is actually all my own fault, because you cannot really make any CRUD functionality to a database that don't have a primary key. We told that the ID should be an identity, but we actually never set it to be a primary key, so there's none of this information that is unique. And when there's none information that is unique, then you cannot go and change it. So let's close this application again and go to our database. So what I forgot in here was to right click the employees table, go to design, and then up just left from our ID, I want to click this arrow, I want to right click it and say set primary key, and then remember to just right click the tab here and say save employee. So now this should work. If we go in and just close this one and say employee, edit top 200 rows, we still have the same information, but let's try and minimize the server management studio, and let's try to see if we click the data again. And we already have an existing database connection, so we just want to hit next on that one. Then we again want to use the employee entity, so just say next, and then let's try to generate the CRUD operations again. So say next on this one, make sure that the employee is tabbed, and then say finish. So now as you can see, we got the add employees Razor page, we also got the edit employees, and now we also have the employees.razor just like before. but now we actually can see that we have an add button, we have some delete buttons. So always remember to set your ID as primary key, if the ID is of course your primary key. So now if we stop the application and let's try to run it again to test it now. So we do get an error, and I think it might because this service is not being updated. So let's try and delete it, and then let's go to the data tab again. And let's hit next on the existing database connection. We want to make sure the employee is tabbed. We want to create the CRUD again, and we just want to make sure the employee is tabbed again and say finish. So now the website actually opened, and let's go to the employees tab, and now you can see we can go and edit the things in here. So if we say save, it will edit it to John 10 instead of John 1, and we can also go and add a new, so let's say Alex, he is a driver. We say save, and we get the new tab or the new row in the database. So this was what we want from the start. So let's go and close it and say stop. We can then go and close the add employee and actually just let close everything, because what we want to go to is the service just like before. So I'll just implement the changes that we just made earlier. So now I just added the code that we put in the earlier service file that we had. So what we want to do now is inside our constructor, we actually want to go and add this connection string. So you can see this string right here, and we just want to say that it should target the company DB database that we have. And that's also, let's go and create the variable for the connection string up here so that we can use it globally inside our service, even though it's actually not necessary. When I think about it, we could also just declare it inside our constructor, because what we're going to do is to give this connection string to our SQL table dependency when we make a new instance of this, so that we can make a connection to the database. But the way we want to do it is that we want to make a new instance of the SQL table dependency, and then we want to feed it with our employees model, and then go and say that this is the connection string, so it know what database it should connect to. And then you want to say that it should be targeting the employee table. And when I see this, I actually think that it might even be smarter to create a whole new folder and maybe call it listeners or something, and then actually create a listener specific to the employees table. Because if you have multiple tables that you want to listen to, then it can actually be quite a mess if you do it all in one file. But of course you can always improve your code. That is the nice thing about programming. So I'll actually just look the other way now from all these ideas I come up with, because else this is actually just looking more and more stupid. But this is a way you can do it also, so don't worry. So when you create this SQL table dependency, you just want to say that when onChanged, you want to target the changed method, and this is actually the listener. So when this one is set, we say that when there is some changes in the database, please run the changed method that we're going to create in just a moment. And then finally, we want to start the dependency to actually listen to the database after changes. So the next thing we will do is to make this change method. So I just created it down here. It's a public async method that returns void, so it don't return anything, but it will be called changed. And when it's called, we have some parameters that we can take a look at, but in this project we don't use it for anything. So right now we could actually go and test if the debugging is working properly in Radzen Blazor Studio. So let's just go and say var and say something like test equals to 0 or to 9, and then let's go and set a breakpoint in here. And just so we can test this on the front page, let's open our index.razor file and then go to this methods tab, because then inside our index.razor file we want to override. So let's say override, and we want to override the onInitialized async, and then it asks what file do we want to do it in, and we want to do it in the index.razor. So say create. So if I just go and hit the split view, we can scroll down and see we now have an onInitialized async method, which is the method that is going to be run every time we load the page. But for now, let's just go and just say that we want to see the source of this code so we get a full screen. Then inside our code, I want to create a new property called employees. And what this is it's an iCurable that is going to be feed with our employee model. So basically it's just a type of list that is going to be our employees. Then we also want to inject the service to this file. So what I have done is that we want to inject our company DB service into this file. We then call it DB service. So what we can do now is to say that we want to use the DB service to get the employees. And because this is an async method, then we want to await it, and then we want to put it inside our employees variable. So we're not actually displaying these employees right now on the front page, but that's okay because they will be loaded and then hopefully hit our breakpoint in the service file that we have. So let's just save this and say run. And of course I just have to close it again and stop it because we need to say that we want to do it in debugging mode. And now that the page is loaded, we should be able to go and change something in our database to hit the breakpoint. So now that we're inside our database again, let's go and just say that his name is John, not John 10, and hit enter. And now you can see we hit the breakpoint of the SQL table dependency listener that we just created. So basically what just happened is that when we run this company DB service, it will run the constructor first. And when we do run the constructor, we also set up the listener here. And then we started to listen to the database after changes, so that when we change something in the database, it will hit this change method. So I actually just want to stop it again, and let's just remove the breakpoint. So let's go and delete the thing inside changed method. So the thing we will do when we have some changes in our database is to fetch a whole new list of the employees, because we know there is some changes, so we can just go and refresh the whole list. So normally we want to say that inside our context we want to target the employees, so we get the employees from the employee table. We do then want to say as no tracking, and I think that was because of an identity framework catching stuff, because if we don't include this, then it will actually just fetch an old record from the database and not take the brand new changes that has been to the database. So we don't want to track any changes, we just want to have a brand new fetch table. And finally we want to say that this should be converted to a list. And I know that this is weird that we're going to create it to a list and not a iQueryable, because it is an iQueryable that we're going to display on the page, as you can see here. And the reason for that is that we're going to use Signal R to push this new information to the index.razor file, and you're not able to push an iQueryable because Signal R is sending its information as JSON, and a list is actually JSON, but an iQueryable is not JSON. So the simple thing we can do is just to create a list, then send it to the index.razor file, and then just convert the list to an iQueryable. But we actually do have another issue by doing this, and that is that in this case, when we run the context, then the context is actually disposed, and I think that has something to do with the lifespan of how a context works. So for example, when we initialize it in here, it will be called as DB service, then it will call this constructor, and if we go back to the index.razor, it will then go into the get employees to get the employees. And when this page has loaded, then my guess is that it just disposed this DB service. But there is a way around that, and that is actually just inside our service here. We want to make a new instance of the service. But again, you cannot do that simply by saying new and then the service name, so company DB service. That is not going to work. So what we're going to use is a service scope factory. And don't worry if you've never heard about it. I never heard about it before this, but it allows us to create a new instance of the service inside this service. So first of all, inside our constructor, I want to add this iService scope factory and just name it service scope factory. Then I want to save it in a global variable so we can use it down in our changed method. So we also have to make this variable up here. And that should actually be it, because this should come, as you can see, from the Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection library. So we are actually able to use this iService scope factory. So now down in our changed method, we can go and create a new scope by using the service scope factory. So we just say create scope, and then inside here we want to say inside the scope, we want to use the service provider and then say that it should get the required service. And this is not the service that we want to use, but we want to use the company DB service. and then just hit save, because this is the service that we are currently inside, and that was the one that we want to make a new context out of that is not already disposed. So now we're almost done inside our changed method. So now we have to take a look at signal R, because it is with signal R that we want to send this employees list. It's the updated employees. We want to send it to a hub that Signal R creates for us. And basically what a hub is in Signal R is just a class that the website is going to connect to listen to if there is anything pushed to the website. So actually when we load the index.razor file, so this is just the front page, we will actually inside here go and say that this page should connect to a hub that we're going to create in just a moment. So this page are actually going to be a client inside the hub, and that allows us, when we are inside the hub, to push changes to the clients that are connected to the hub. If it doesn't make sense, just hang on. We will go and just open our project here, and then we want to add a new folder. So we say new directory, and this one should be called hub, and say okay. So it took a little bit time before it popped up. I actually just closed this and open it. I hope it helps. But what we want to do inside the hub folder is to right click and say new file, and what I want to call it is employee hub.cs file. So this is a hub that we're going to connect to if we want to have some data pushed that has something to do with the employee. So let's say okay. So first of all, we want to make a namespace in here, which will be our project name, so real-time data, and then we will call it hub and just close it off. So this is the name we're going to use when we want to use the employee hub in another file. Then we want to make the class, so let's say a public class that we want to call employee hub, and we want to extend this class by the hub class, and then of course open and close it. And then we want to tell that this hub class comes from the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Signal R package. And that should actually be it for the employee hub class. And that's because we just extended by the hub, so all the functionality that we get to the employees hub comes from the hub class, and that is actually enough to create your own hub. So for now, let's go to the index.razor file so that we can say that we want to connect to a hub. So the first thing we will do is to actually implement the Signal R client library, and then we can go and make a variable for the hub connection. So I want to make a private variable where we take the hub connection class and then put it inside the hub connection variable. So to actually create the hub connection, we want to use the hub connection builder, where we say that we want to connect to this URL, and then the URL will be the absolute URI called /employee hub. So there's actually one important thing that we need to do. We need to go to the program.cs file to actually implement Signal R into our builder and into our app. So just beneath the add DB context, I want to include this add response compression, and we don't really have to think so much about this. It's actually just so Signal R know how to compress the data that it's going to send. So we don't even have to understand this, but we want to include the library that it comes from, which is this Microsoft ASP.NET Core response compression. So now that we configured the response compression, we also want to include it into the app. So we do want to say app.use response compression, and then finally here at the bottom beneath the map Blazor hub, I want to add the map hub, which is the Signal R way of declaring a new URL to the actual employees hub that we created. So we just want to use the employee hub and say that the URL to this hub is the employee hub. And this is actually the reason that we in our index file can say that we want to target the URL employee hub when we connect to the hub, because then it will go to this URL. And then inside our program.cs, it knows that this URL is going to say that we want to connect to the employee hub. And then just at the top, we also want to say that we want to use the real-time data.hub folder so that it knows where the employee hub is. So inside our index.razor page, we also need to include this navigation. So we will just go and inject the navigation manager up here and say that the variable is navigation. so that we can use it here. So the next thing we will do with our hub connection, now that we have created or actually built the hub connection, we can go and say hub connection and then on. And what that means is that every time we have a push from the server where the name is refresh employees, then we expect that there comes some new employees, and then we can use these employees to save them in the employees that is actually being displayed on the page. And as you might remember, we get this as a list because that is JSON. But then we want to say as curable because we want to convert it to AI curable instead. And finally, when the employees are going to refresh, then we want to say invoke async and say that the state has changed. And this will just basically update the UI to use the new variable. So the last thing we have to do is to actually start the hub connection. So we say hub connection, start async, and then await it. So this should actually be it to listen to a hub if there comes any request with the name of refresh employees. So what we have to do now is to go and actually create this push from the server to this index.razor file. And that should actually be pretty easy to do, because if we go to the company DB service file again, then we in our changed method are just going to update the employees, so we get a list of new employees, and that's actually just the employees that we want to push with SignalR to the hub, so that our index.razor file can see that there's something new happen in the hub, and it takes that information. So if we just scroll up a bit, we can implement the iHub context, which allow us to say that we want to act as the employee hub. So we actually also want to go and dependency inject this iHub context so that we can use the employee hub. And this of course also require that we include SignalR into this service. So we do want to include Microsoft ASP.NET Core SignalR and also the client. So now when that's done, we can go down again, or we actually also need to include the hub, of course. So we say using and then say real-time data, and we want to use the hub. So by doing this, we're going to say that we want to use the employee hub. And of course, we also need to give this a variable name so that we can go and say the dependency injected variable should be equal to our global variable inside this method. So down in our constructor, we want to say underscore hub context is equal to the hub context. So now inside our changed method, we can actually go and use it. So in here we can say underscore hub context, which is what we dependency injected. It is actually the way to our employee hub. And what we want to say then is that we want to target the clients, and who of them, it's actually all of them that we want to send this data to, and we want to call the name of what we sent for refresh employees, so that every client that listens to this refresh employees will get the code via the hub. And then of course we want to send the new employees that we just fetched from the database. So I think that should actually be it. But if we go to the index.razor file, we of course also want to display the employees. So we can just get rid of all this code. And then I want to insert this new Radzen DataGrid. And then we say that the T item that we want to use is the employee from our models. And the data that we want to display is coming from the employees variable. I then also say that we want to allow filtering, so that is true. And then inside the Radzen DataGrid, we want to specify some columns. And these should be Radzen DataGrid columns, where we again say what model it should use. And that should be our employee model. The property name should be name, and the title should also be name in this case. And that's simply just to say that inside our employee we have a name, so display that, and the title of this column should be name. And then we do the same with the title. So let's try and test this and see if it runs. So we'll just run it, and there was actually an error, but that was because inside my employees hub I called the hub for the same as the namespace, and of course we cannot go and change this. So let's go and change the hub just to hubs. So to do that on every page, we need to go to the service again, and let's find the hub and say that it hubs instead. And then the last place we need to go and change this is in our program.cs file, where we also want to say that it should be hubs instead. And then I can see I also have an error inside the index.razor file on line 21. So let's go and look at that. And I think it's just because we need to delete this. And then we have a last error, which I can see is in the service file. So if we scroll a bit down, we can see on line 63 that it gives an error on the company DB service. And that's of course me that explained this very wrong, because we actually want to have a new DB context and not a new service. And it is actually the company DB context that of course are going to be disposed in this code. So now let's try and run this again. Or actually we need to also say that we want to use the data folder. So let's just roll up and then copy and paste this line and say that we want to use the data folder, because that's where our context is. If we just open this in our data folder here, we can see the company DB context. So now I think we should try to run this again. And now you can see we actually get the Radzen DataGrid with the information that we want. So if we go and just hit Control and then open this employees in a new tab and then make the screen half, then let's try to edit in the John name. So let's say John 1, and we want to hit save and then see if it live updates over here. And yeah, there's actually an error that we need to fix also. So let's go back to Radzen Blazor Studio. And I know this error because I have been dealing a lot with it. I have actually created a whole article about this error and also a video actually. And it is that in .NET 7, when we use that and when we use Entity Framework, then if we have some triggers in our database, we basically have two options. Either we can delete the triggers, and if that's not an option, then you want to roll back to use the older technique that Entity Framework is using, because when we use .NET 7, then it uses a better technique to fetch some of the data from the database and manipulate it. But our only option is actually to go inside our on model creating. So I'll just copy this line and go to our context file. So inside the data folder, we want to open our context. And then inside this on model creating, we want to tell Entity Framework that we have some triggers in our database. And we have not created these triggers manually. I think they come from the SQL table dependency class. So if we want to use the SQL table dependency listener, we need to say to Entity Framework that there is some triggers in our database and that it should use the less better technique to manipulate the employee table. But that's also okay for this project. So now let's save this and let's stop the application and try to run it again. And now let's just go and take it on the one side and take our front page on the other side. So let's try again to edit this, say John 1 and say save. And now you can see it will automatically update on the front page. So it's very handy if you have some users that are just allowed to read some information like this, but that they should not be able to, delete and add things, and that they have to see this live. And then over on the other side here, we have some administration that can actually go and delete some rows. So let's say we want to delete this. So we hit the delete icon and we say OK. And then you can see it will be deleted. We can also go and say add. And let's try to add a new name. So let's say Jasper is a driver also. So we want to save this. And now you can see he's being added. And then we can go and edit the name of him also. We can also go and edit the title and it will instantly update. So you could imagine that you could go and make some very nice UI with this, with some live data. And the nice thing about this is that you don't have a script that is going to check the MS SQL database, like every 5 seconds or something, just spamming it, because it will only get updated when there is actually some changes to the database. But I hope you like this video, and please like the video and subscribe to my channel, and else just have a nice day. Bye.